Hello there. My name is Jonathan Friedman, and you are listening to the FAQs podcast by EHN Canada. This is a show where we scour the internet for the most frequently asked questions about mental health and addiction and ask an expert for their answers to them. Today, it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce to you my special guest, Nick Holmesy. Nick is a firefighter, 15 years, registered psychotherapist, founder of After the Call, a free online resource for first responders and their families, and a research collaborator with McMaster and Western universities. Nick has publications with the Firewall Research Lab, Crackle Magazine, Firefighting in Canada, and Canadian Firefighting, International Firefighting, Firefighter Nation, and other publications. He's appeared in news articles and on podcasts discussing and critiquing the state of mental health education and treatment in Canadian firefighting. He's also the clinical director for the EHN Guardians Gateway Centre, and will be beginning a PhD with Western University in the fall, looking at the mental health impacts of volunteer firefighters. Nick, what a resume. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Jonathan. Thanks for the suspiciously short intro.
Suspiciously short. Before we get into our, of course, 5 questions today, I'd love for you to tell the listeners a bit about yourself and your journey into the field of mental health care. Out of all the fields you could have chosen, why this one?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it connects to what we're talking about today, actually. So, when I was 17, 18, I was going to become a video game designer. That was what I was destined to do. That was where my career trajectory went. I went so far as emailed all of the big video game designers. So that would be like Neversoft from the Tony Hawk games and things like that. And I said, if you're hiring, what do you need on a resume? And actually they got back to me and they told me what they would want on the resume. And I was like, perfect. And so I went to Sheridan when I was 18 for their systems analyst. That was step 1, get that under my belt. And I hated it. I hated sitting in the classroom for 8 hours a day, hated being on the computer. I would argue I was also too young to have gone away from school and trended towards the immature maybe. So I wasn't ready. And ended up coming home, dropping out after about 4 or 5 months. And that was a pretty hard point for me because that was what I was going to do. So when I landed, obviously I had a bit of time to lick my wounds back with my parents, but then, I've got to be doing something. And I applied and joined the fire department. My dad was on, so it was an easy kind of thing to do. But I joined the fire department. So I joined the fire service at 18 years old. And then, I did that for a little bit, but, after about a year or two, I said, I want to be a career firefighter. I want to go in, I want firefighting to be what I pay my mortgage and my bills with, and so forth. And lots of things had happened in between there. Now, one of the kind of hallmark staple moments for me, without being too graphic, but we got a call one time. It was an individual died by suicide by train. I think this was still in my 18th year, so this would have been January, February, based on what I remember from it being cold. And I attended this call, and what was really fascinating to me then, and still when I think about it now, is we were there, police were there, EMS were there. The conductor gets off the train, and I can't remember which company it was for that he was working for, but he gets off the train and he is doing okay. This is not the first one that he has been through. He said, they're sending someone to come pick me up. They're going to drop me off at the psychologist's office. I'm going to have a conversation to make sure I'm okay with what's gone on today. They're going to give me 2 weeks holidays paid off. And then I'm going to check in with the psychologist again before I return back to work. And this was this is early in the morning. So I think it's probably around 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, which means EMS and police, OPP in our jurisdiction at the time, just started their day. And I think we went on to run a couple more calls that day too. And that really stuck with me, because of the kind of the traumatic experiences of the call. And we could talk a little bit about trauma and first responders, of course, but also just the stark contrast between the fact that this person whose job isn't to navigate or deal with these things had all of this psych care, all of this kind of really wraparound services, and we had nothing. And so this was like probably 2007, 2008, something like that. So I didn't know it at the time, but that planted a huge seed for me. And so, as I said, I was going to go become a career firefighter. So I went back to college, and I wasn't able to get right into the pre-service because it's a pretty competitive program, and I didn't have some of the science credits, whatever. So I got into pre-health, and part of the pre-health credits I had to get was a psychology course. And that was probably one of the first times I excelled at anything in school, so much so that the instructor pulled me aside and said, if there was at all any interest, I would really recommend you trying this at somewhere, a somewhat higher level. And so I heeded her bet, and I transferred out of the pre-service and went into a university transfer program, went on to get my undergrad, and still during all of this was with the fire department. Still running the calls, still doing the things, going to the training. And, I got my undergrad, and shortly after that went on to do my master's. And so that was kind of the four-way was, so certainly some of the things that I've been through and seen, but also the stark contrast. And I think just sometimes you're in the right place at the right time with the right people. And someone had taken a chance, pulled me aside. She absolutely didn't have to do that. And just nudged me in a completely different trajectory. Now, with the volley service, which is what I am an active still, the benefit to that is that I can do all of these other things while, I'm just responding to the calls as they come through. And so that's the lucky part, is that I've continued to be part of the fire service and continue now. But that was the trajectory. That's how I got into mental health, and first responders was always my angle, always the thing that I did off the corner of the desk. But until really recently, we didn't have any really specialized care for first responders. It's really launched maybe some places earlier than others, but maybe like 2018, 2019, I think we really start seeing larger populations of groups of people looking at this as a specific population trait.
That's super interesting. It's always one of my favorite questions, and everybody has, I feel, that one shifting experience at some point that they're like, mental health care. And it's always interesting to me.
I have to tell you, it's not like, it's, if you want to be people's favorite person at the party, mental health and first responders is not the connection that you try to make, right? Like, yeah, it's, so in all things that I've done, adversity has been in the way, and in my interest, apparently it's no different. I'll, take firefighting and I'll try to inject mental health because that's one of the harder things to do. So why not?
Absolutely. So speaking of adversity, today our big topic is resilience, specifically in the first responder and firefighter community. Nick, are you ready to get down to the nitty-gritty and dive into the internet's biggest questions on this topic?
Sure. Let's talk resilience.
Let's do it. So I think the first important question is, how do you define resilience? What is it?
It's a great question. And I think the weeds that we can get into when we talk about this is that you could ask me, I could give you a definition. You could ask somebody else, they're going to give you a definition. And we all think we know what resilience means when we talk about it. And certainly there is something to it. We can all think of some of these stories that we've heard or some of the things that we've experienced. And how we got through it is often the kind of the phrase that we talk about. It's like, I have no idea how I got through that. But there's a pretty big problem that we have when it comes to this. So the two things that I try to always balance out is my frontline work as a therapist and firefighter, and then the other work that I do around research. And so I find one is like really this practical piece of helping others in where they are at. And then there's this other piece about getting it right with what we're doing. And the research is very clear that we have no real idea how to measure or identify resilience right now. We have lots of different ways that we are pitching that this can be done, but there is nothing definitive. So we can't even agree on a definition of resilience that is not going to fit all kind of the research and papers that we're looking at. So in the first responder world, resilience is massive though, because, and really when we talk about resilience, we're talking about multiple different resiliences, right? So when I talk about resilience, I'm talking about your ability to be in a profession, one of the emergency services or any kind of public safety personnel positions, to be able to go through that career and, you can start the career. There's a bit of a black box in the middle of what happens during that career, and then you retire out of that career. And for me, whatever happens at the beginning and in that middle, but the end is that I've chosen my own kind of end date for that career. So whether I retire out or I decide that I want to make a change or something like that, my goal, and after the call, always, our focus always was that people get to do that on their own terms. They're not kind of forced out of that. And so resilience is really important for me on the mental health sphere of how do we stay well enough during those periods that when I decide to make a change, I get to do that on my own, and I'm not kind of waylaid by mental health struggles or an inability to recover to an area where I can return to work, things like that. But then there's other people who think that resilience, or believe rather, resilience is simply engaging in voluntarily engaging in difficult things. So, I kind of joke, some of my friends are in this sphere, and, so resilience to them is cold showers, ice baths, and, 24-hour training engagements. And then again, they think that this builds resilience and this builds grit. And maybe it does. And I don't think that we should take anything away from people that think that that's resilience. And then we have this third kind of group where resilience and another term called post-traumatic growth are kind of married together. So to them, the resilience is not only do I engage in a career of trauma, but that trauma is going to indefinitely mark me somehow. And based on how I navigate that, the end state and goal is that I'm not only just going to stay healthy, I'm going to be stronger, better, and healthier. And to that point as well, the research is very unclear on what that means, how to measure it. And maybe that's a different podcast, but it's very interesting on that aspect. But the bottom line, Jonathan, one of the things that bothers me about it is that we've kind of taken that resilience and we buy into it hook, line, and sinker, that this is a thing that can be taught, bought, or sold. And as a volunteer firefighter, one of the things that is really important for all people to recognize, because I think this is news to most, is that the volunteer sector is 80+% of the entire fire service in Canada, which means when you drive down the 401 corridor, your expectation is that if you get in an accident in Toronto, or you get in an accident in Trenton, or you get in an accident in Grafton, or you get in an accident wherever, that you're going to get the same level of service. And in fact, the law kind of states that should be the case. But all through that is going to be these departments where the people showing up to help and support you are at another job before they land there, or they're, working the farms, or they're retired. And that sector has zero money, right? So that sector has they're making decisions about, do I upgrade the apparatus from 1986 and buy a new truck because we desperately need it? Do I outfit a new firefighter in gear that's $10,000 each time that they buy it? Or do I spend thousands of dollars in a mental health program, right? Just out of sheer necessity, the mental health program is always going to be bottom list of what is affordable. And to me, some of the programs that are out there, some of the larger ones that we know about, there's thousands of dollars to participate in. And then, which, kind of what we're talking about, touching on, is that the research that vets out whether these are actually doing anything for anybody is vague at best. And some of the preliminary numbers, honestly, just aren't that convincing that the programs are working in the way that we are saying that they work. And so to me, my interest, of course, is wading into those kind of unpopular waters, because there's a lot of, I think that the space is filled by a lot of people that want to do good, want to help. And, having engaged in some very professional debates on the topic, this idea of research takes too long, it's too expensive, we need to help as many people as we can. I agree with all of that, except for, because it feels good doesn't mean it is good. And I think that those are really the pieces. So that's a long-winded answer to say we don't really know what resilience is. We think we have an idea of what resilience is. We can talk about things that are similar and echo with each other about what resilience is. But to say that we kind of know enough to then produce something that will either build, strengthen, develop resilience, we don't have that yet.
Thank you. That was really thorough. I love that. So I think everybody at home, our listeners, probably also have some vague idea of what resilience is. Why is resilience important specifically to first responders?
Yeah, I think so. There's kind of maybe at least two levels of why, right? So let's talk about the front line. So for the frontline people, we got into these careers because we wanted to serve. We wanted to give back to the community. And of course, there's lots of ways to give back, but being a first responder is one of the most immediate ways to give back, right? Is you're called to people's worst days. This is kind of what we always say, is that, when my pager goes off, to respond out, it's someone's worst day. And what we know now, and what we've always kind of known but ignored, but what we know now is that people's worst days can be pretty bad, and what can happen to them is pretty horrific. And we're responding as first responders to this consistently and constantly. That's how we collect our paycheck. Now, don't get me wrong. Again, if I look at fire specifically, I can't speak for the other agencies, right? But if I look at fire specifically, 80+% of my calls that I would get toned out for are going to be medical calls that I'm assisting EMS with. And these would be like chest pains and heart conditions and heart attacks. So not necessarily the big kind of heavy hitters that we think about. But that doesn't mean that we don't also see those pieces, right? So resilience is important for the frontline people because they want to be able to continue to do the job that they love and continue to serve. So if there's some magic soup out there that I can drink for which then the things that I see roll off my back, we want to know what that soup is and how to brew it. And I think that there's again, leaning on the fire aspect, we need to know so many things about so many things. We need to know building construction. We need to be a mechanic. We need to be a plumber. We need to be an electrician, all to understand how, a fire will progress through a building or how to dismantle a car to get somebody out. And the last thing we also need to be is then a researcher and therapist. So this idea that I will hear a program be called resilient, whatever, I will just buy that program because I just assume that it's going to be the thing that does the thing. But in an effort to have a long, fulsome career in a job that I love, I need to be able to manage what I'm going to see and do, right? So we always talk about it's what we see, but it's not really what we see. It's also what we do, right? I'm not just looking at things. Often I'm engaged on things. I'm touching people, and I'm actively an active participant in these scenes. And so for me, having some resilience or being able to get some resilience means that I can feel a little bit more comfortable knowing that what I see and what I go through, I can manage that easier, whatever that means. So that's the front lines aspect, why resilience is important. But then if we go up the ladder and look at the organizations as a whole, resilience is important for a few reasons too. Similarly, they, of course, I think, although organizations differ, I think by and large, on the most part, most organizations want their folks to be happy enough, right? They want their folks to be happy and healthy, are not afraid to invest some time and money into trying to ensure that happens. How that's rolled out, again, different podcasts completely about organizational stressors, a whole other aspect. But by and large, most people just want their workers to be happy and healthy. But the elephant in the room is there's also a very large financial aspect of workers off work, right? And in the cost of having, especially career departments, the cost of having somebody off, let alone the actual fact that a human being is not at work because of the things that they had to do because of their job, but also the fact that organization now has to pay somebody else to work the overtime, hire a new person, redo all the training, when they would rather that skilled worker just come back. And so that's the kind of the two aspects of why first responders want these resilient pieces. They want to be able to ensure people are happy and healthy, work long time careers, and they want to ensure that the money that they have to run these places can continue to go into the important pieces and improvements and innovations, and be able to support that. So for the frontline users, they're not going to want to hear about the organizational pieces, right? But also, I think there's lots of leaders that have to balance, especially in the volley world, have to balance the bottom line obligations with actually having a department that can run to calls versus having this aspect holding off their head. So to that point, I think a lot of departments, volley departments I'm talking about here, really just hope that nothing happens. And that's not a great place to be. So they're very much interested and invested in finding a program that will give them resilience. So I think that those are really the bigger issues and bigger key reasons that resilience is so important and really kind of a hot topic for emergency personnel and for all kind of public safety personnel.
So resilience on the individual level to keep you going and feeling able to do the work you're doing, but also resilience as retention, really.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And that's an important piece of the pie. Because if we get that magic soup, as I said, then the organization is going to want to invest in it and the frontline can trust in it. And so it's a mutually beneficial aspect. It's just, that we're not sure we have the soup yet.
We got to find that soup. So what have the attempts at this soup been? What training exists to foster resilience in the first responder or firefighter community more specifically?
So there are a couple of really large programs that would be pretty mainstays for most people, right? So we have Beyond Occupational Stress would be a large program, really kind of coming out of the Wounded Warriors gang. We have Resilient Minds, which is onboarded by CMHA, but was co-developed with firefighter. I think it's Calgary, though I might need to be fact-checked on that. That put together a Resilient Minds course. And then there's the Road to Mental Readiness, which is a military-based, adapted for kind of the civilian population. And all of them to some degree, I mean, Resilient Minds itself has resilient in the name. So we can assume that that's what they're getting at. And the others are about proactive approaches. So as attempts, I think great, right? Like I think that we need something and we need to be putting it out there. But there have been some really large studies at this point that have looked at pre and post implementation of the programs and have found that the data coming out of that hasn't really moved the needle in any meaningful ways, right? So some of the programs, for instance, after utilization, no noticeable marker differences on symptoms of mental health that we might measure, like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, those typical things, but might improve stigma in the workplace, right? So those are like the really big ones that everybody knows about. But of course, you can come to a lot of therapists and smaller organizations, and they will say, "No problem, Jonathan. Do I have the Resilient course for you?" And that'll be in the frame of mind of sort of like a psychoed course. Now, the psychoed course is even worse, where the psychoed course, and this I just have to say, as I used to do this for departments in halls that asked, because I thought it was the right thing to do, and I thought I absolutely moved the needle. But the research is clear, we're not moving the needle at all. So when people ask me to come in and do a psychoed course, I say, listen, happy to do it, happy to come out, happy to support. I just need you to know that if there's an expectation that this is going to move the needle, the research doesn't vet that out. And so there's some really interesting pieces about that coming out of Oxford, but certainly within our own realm, Dr. Nicholas Carlton's doing a lot of the major research and work, and he's got some really interesting things going on with RCMP that I think could move the needle, and he has some really kind of supporting reasons for that. But as it stands now, I think the big piece to notice, or to note, I should say, about this really is that those other pieces, aside from Resilient Minds, which I specifically know it's attached to some research out of either McMaster or Western. They work together, so I'm not sure which one's leading it. But so I know that they're attached, but we don't really have any large research bodies looking at pre, post, and going through, right? And Jonathan, I don't know if you've ever attended any mental health training or really any training course, typically, right? You get the feedback form at the end. And maybe it's a Canadian thing, but I'm going to guess most people are going to just score it as it was a great course. Thanks for your time and effort, because we're just appreciative, right? And so that's the issue here is we have this feedback loop where we get people to give us their feedback, which says, "It was great. I loved it. Thank you so much. I learned so much." And then actually measuring that at the outset doesn't come to fruition, right? So there's this really, if I can. I'm a bit of a nerd, but so there's this really interesting study that came out I forget when and where. It doesn't really matter to the point of the story. But they took undergraduate students and they asked them to complete all of these assessments. And they said, how are you doing? How are you adjusting? What's going on, right? So they do all these scores. And then, university's hard. It sucks. I don't know what's going on. Things are really terrible. Things like that is what they're reading. 4 months later, or something like this, less than 6 months later, they reassessed them, right? Same assessments, got them to fill all the scores and then asked them, right? So we have this quantitative aspect. We have this qualitative aspect. Just like what actually has happened. They said, I've learned so much. I've grown so much. I think I'm way more confident. And then they look at their scores and they're worse. So all of them had scored worse than what they were doing. So we have this I think, human thing where we're like, things are great, things are fine. And then when I'm asked to measure it, there's a stark contrast between those two bits. So I really use that to demonstrate that this kind of feedback that is reliant only on looking back at something is giving us pretty skewed measures, which, by the way, has been the majority of the research in the first responder sector has been on retrospective research. So we're looking backwards and asking them to think about. And we have no real research on prospective front-end loaded research measuring from day one across time. And those are some of the research bits that we absolutely need.
So sort of the TLDR of that is Canadians are too nice, start giving proper
it could be
feedback.
Yeah, it could be. And maybe it's a fire service thing too. I think we're just always really appreciative that of the trainings and things we get in. And I don't have to learn, about ladders anymore. I can learn about something different, but it could be a Canadian thing.
It's really, really interesting. So big buzzword whenever I go on LinkedIn, and probably a slightly different community there, everyone is talking about burnout. What does burnout look like in the first responder community? I feel we've touched on this a little bit already, but how can first responders avoid burnout?
I mean, that's $1 million question, Jonathan. If we could come up with a program, that says, avoid burnout, we'd be millionaires. I think it's tough because there's so many different factors. Maybe I'm just a poor businessman, Jonathan. Like maybe I need to think about this more and stop thinking about the actual practical application of some of these things. I'd be a millionaire. I could just say, this is how to do it. All you got to do is, breathe through your nose 5 times and your burnout will go away. But for me, it's about getting it right and about really understanding it. So to avoid burnout, I think is a really tough question. It's a tough answer to give you. But there are some things that I think would just generally help, right? We need to checklist a few things. We need to make sure that our reliance on the typical cultural resiliency tactics that we use, alcohol and drugs is one of the number one, alcohol especially, number one coping measure, especially for fire, but for other organizations as well, that we use, right? So, and it used to be that we had beer fridges in the fire halls, and there's a reason for that. That was the mainstay of coping and strategy for navigating it. So I would say that we need to look at how we cope and what we cope with and what the cultural norm of coping is. In the fire stations, we talk about the table, right? The table is really an important place in a fire hall because that's where everybody comes, collects, sits down and chats and navigates some of the hard bits. And sometimes it's just a place where we can get that dark humor out without, a phone in our face and filming it. But it's those connective in connections that we make. And I think to some degree when the fire service moved, now this is me speculating, so somebody can tell me to kick rocks and that I got it wrong. But when we moved to the 24s, people aren't hanging around to go out for dinner, grab a drink with the guys and gals anymore, right? They're going home and they're driving hours away usually, right? Like, we have people live in Peterborough that work in Toronto. So they, drive to Toronto to work and drive to Peterborough home, where it used to be in smaller communities, especially that, you lived and worked in that same town. And so you got that social connection. And so that would be the other bit. We talk about social connections all the time, but however, I can have 1,000 friends, but if I don't talk to anybody, that's not really social connection. So it's more than actually having a social network. It's actually engaging that social network. Let's be frank. the first responder world, especially in fire, is mostly men. So, I think sitting down with another male to, in a culture steeped in masculinity or masculineness, whatever that means, is not going to go, hey, I'm feeling blue today. Do you mind if I talk about my feelings? And I think that that's one thing that we also have to navigate, because when we talk about trying to avoid burnout, one of the important bits is also understanding what's going on with us, right? So I like to tell people, and I meet them in the therapy room or in the training room, I say, we have two emotions, especially as men, but I think I would say that the socialization of women into these professions also trends in this direction, right, to fit in. And I would say that we have two emotions. We feel anger, and we feel the emotion that we feel when the hockey team wins, whatever that is. And those are the two emotions we're allowed to feel. So I think another aspect of trying to avoid burnout is understanding what's going on with me, what is happening, and how do I communicate that effectively to somebody, whether that's a close friend or whether that's a professional that can help me manage those things. And that would be the third bit that I would say to help avoid burnout is engaged with a professional in a meaningful and proactive way. So first responders are really good at making sure that they are in the worst possible condition before going to see therapy, right? Just like we are in the worst possible condition before we go to the doctors, before we're in the worst possible condition before we go to the dentist. It's just one of our faults. But as you know, but maybe others don't know, like the moment I'm having a crisis is not the moment to try to hunt down a therapist I can trust and talk to and build that connection, right? I'm already 5 steps too late and 5 steps too far behind. So what we need to do is start looking for professionals that I can connect with now before the problem exists, who we can get that awkward 5 sessions out of the way at the front end, so it doesn't feel like I'm just talking to some stranger all the time, and that I can check in every 6 months to a year, who has me on the list. And that way, when a crisis strikes, also more likely to say, hey, I can sneak you in or I can fit you in here. And so I think that that's another aspect of burnout. And I think a third aspect that maybe isn't talked about a lot, and again, this is from the fire perspective, is expectations of the career versus realities, right? When we get into fire, the expectation is we're putting water on the red stuff and we're cutting apart cars. And as I said, 80+% of our calls are, going to chest pain calls and lift assists. And so this idea, and then you move into the career departments, and I say career here only because the majority of the career departments are the ones you find in city centers, who are then dealing with kind of the addictions and substance use problems that go on in centers. So, I hear a lot of the time from career guys who are running multiple calls to the same person for overdoses, for instance. If the first responders aren't always so empathetic to the addiction cycle, right? And again, it's hard for them to be therapists as well. And so yet, while I understand kind of the life and breadth of an addiction and why people can get what they get, they don't. They just want them to stop, can't figure out they stop, and it's selfish that they won't. And so then that breeds resentment and anger and frustration. And then I think that can also couple with the fact that I'm a firefighter. Why am I at all these medical calls all the time? Or why am I running overdose calls? Or why am I on the truck that runs strictly to do those things and those types of setups? So that expectation divide between what's going on and what I signed up for, I think can be really hard too. And so it's really, I think, understanding what the role of the career job is and understanding what types of work you're going to be doing to prep for that.
And I really appreciate your answer there, Nick. And I just want to say, over the summer, just personal story time quick. I went into anaphylactic shock for the first time ever. And I'm very allergic to lots of things, but I ate a cracker that had almonds in it, and I tasted death. It was very close. I gave myself the EpiPen, and I had 3 firefighters who were at my door within 5 minutes with everything I needed, and they were there with me for probably about 40 minutes before I got the rest of the help I needed. So that 80% is very meaningful.
Yeah. And I think that, that's a great news story, right? We want to respond to calls. Just the other day, for instance, we were out doing some training in ice water, and we got a tone out for what came across as kids in the water. And so that's obviously very scary. And, we're Of course, in the water training. So now we have to get out of the water and get all of our stuff together. So it's a bit hectic, and it is what it is. But then it shortly thereafter comes across that it's like kids out on the ice doing snow angels, right? It's like, and and I remember just saying to somebody that those are the types of calls we want to get, right? That's the tone we want, is that's the outcome of it. Or like yourself, where the outcome is positive. And those, I think, are I think for the most people, those are the meaningful calls, right? I'm doing something, there's clearly an emergency here happening. But I think that resentment can grow, especially when we have a lack of understanding on top of it, and maybe a lack of willingness to understand, frankly, when it comes to some of the kind of repetitive calls that we might do when it comes to substance use and addiction. And I think that, truthfully, I think that there's lots that we can do to bolster our own, kind of support there, whether we want to call that resilience or not. But I also just think that there needs to be a willingness to understand and learn about some of the calls that are really going to grind our gears in terms of my value of what I'm meant to be doing and what it seems like I'm doing, and the meaningfulness of that, right? So I think that there's some education and cultural shifts that we can do just through the understanding of addiction, based on the fact that these are going to be some of the calls that we run.
Totally. So I think we're getting there. So if you had your magic ladle and could make your magic soup, what does the future of building resilience look like in the first responder community, knowing that we're not there today? There's lots of work, lots of research to do. But if you could look into the crystal ball, what is it showing you, or what would you like it to show you?
What I think is clear when it comes to the research, what I think is clear, and obviously I don't know everything, but what I think is clear is if we're focused on modifiable factors, so those are things that we can see shifts in when we go see a therapist, for instance. What we're hoping to do is change modifiable factors, my behaviors, how I think about things, my emotional experiences of things, in a way that's meaningful and powerful enough for me to get to where I'd like to be. So when I think about the future of resilience, there are some promising research aspects. So there's been some cool research out of Oxford University that have looked at, for instance, what's called the unified protocol. So it's a trans-diagnostic approach to mental health, what that, fancy word for meaning it treats depression and anxiety at the same time. But what people are finding is it's actually a really great program to give folks preemptively, right, prior to any issues, and build and teach them the skills of navigating things should issues arise. And so I think when I think about resilience, and this is, what people pick at me online for right now, because this is what I'm saying, is that if we can implement those programs into some sort of ongoing program, I think that we will find some promising results. And I'm hopeful, though I'll accept whatever the numbers say, and maybe we're back to the beginning. The problem with it, of course, is it's not a 1 or 2 day course, right? So we can't just show up and listen to someone speak off PowerPoint for 2 days and walk away as resilient individuals. This work is immersive work. It's 12 to 16 sessions of immersive work. And the idea is that you're actually doing active work on yourself during that process. And so, that I think that's what's missing and lacking right now in any of the programs that we're using, is that I'm framing it as psychoeducation, really, and I'm giving it to you as psychoeducation, and that's not nothing. However, it's not quite what I paid for, and it's not quite what I'm hoping to get out of. But I see the future of resilience being organizations, be it big, small, in between, are investing time and money in some place, center, person, whatever it might be, that is willing and able to engage these folks for up to 16 sessions, 12 sessions, whatever we might adapt it to be, to give them the skill set so that they can navigate their own problems as they come up. And once they have that, the unified protocol is really neat in that it will help you. It'll help you outline a problem in such a way that even if you're stuck, and this is what I used to tell clients that would come through it, is like, even if you're stuck, you can now bring that stuckness with you to the therapy session, and we can just start there. I don't actually have to ask you how things are going, what's going on, although I'll do that, right? That's important information, but I wouldn't have to. You could hand me the thing and say, I'm stuck here. This is what I'm stuck with. And you frame the problem for us, which is often a really big piece of the therapy, is helping people frame the problem in such a way that we could tackle it. And that's not what, to my eye and my read, and I've had some exposure to all of the big programs, but to my read, that's not what's being given, right? We're given a color that we decide that we are, or we're given some psychotherapy knowledge, or we're heavily immersed in the psychobiology of how stress occurs, but we're not really given the skills and tools to say, hey, if you're thinking X, how do we know if X is actually true or not? How do we compete against those thoughts that say, believing X is true, I then catastrophize out to all of these other aspects, right? How do I start to navigate the fact that when I'm not working, I feel like not leaving my house? What does that mean? And how do I start to notice that? Because maybe I'm feeling just tired, or I feel drained, or whatever the other kind of lower Q red flags might be, that unless I have that internal knowledge, the emotions, right? Unless I have those bits, I just think I'm having a down day. The down day creeps into weeks, months, years, right? And so I think that there is some promise there. I'm not so naive to put all my eggs in the basket, but I think that there's some good work, and hopefully some good work coming up soon that will point us in whether we're barking up the right tree or not.
Gotta love that soup.
Yes.
Nick, it's been an absolute honor and pleasure to have you on the show. If you're to give somebody looking to start their recovery journey just a small piece of advice, what would you tell them to get that started?
Start soon, start early, and don't worry if the first is not a good fit.
Love that.
I think that's the best way to think it up.
Love that, Nick. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Recovery is possible, and EHN Canada is the place for both virtual and inpatient treatment programs for mental health and addiction. To learn more about the work we do, go to ehncanada.com, or the work Nick specifically does with our military veterans and first responders communities, go to ehnguardians.ca. Listen to even more episodes of 5 Facts. You can check it out on your favorite streaming platform. Nick Carlton and Emily Day, who we mentioned a little earlier on the show, were on some recent episodes, so go check those out. Nick, thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Jonathan.